For many, the Vietnam War takes the cake as the most disastrous foreign intervention of the 20th century. It was a conflict that witnessed brutal guerrilla warfare, civilian casualties, the destruction of villages, the liberal use of incendiary napalm bombs, and the forced conscription of fighting-aged American males, many of whom famously fled to Canada to dodge the draft. Less well known, the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence, which raged simultaneously between 1963 to 1974, witnessed all of this and more. Concluding with the overthrow of the Portuguese government and the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Africa, it can be argued that this obscure West African revolutionary struggle was far more disastrous than even the Vietnam War. Originally part of the colonial government of Cape Verde, another Portuguese possession, the boundaries of the West African country now known as Guinea-Bissau were first drawn out in 1886 in order to distinguish it from France's neighbouring colony of Guinea. Starting in 1878 with the suppression of the troublesome Manjacas and Felupes tribes, for over 50 years the Portuguese waged a protracted military campaign to pacify the populace, with the last vestiges of resistance being stamped out by 1936. Throughout this turbulent period, Portugal's hold over the country was extremely tentative. In 1915, one Brazilian observer remarked in a report that Portuguese settlers in Bissau were living behind the defence of their town walls, and no one could go safely into the interior. Bissau was really a camp, outside which they feared the vengeance of the native inhabitants. Portugal's loose grip on the colony was exacerbated by their tiny amount of white settlement. In contrast to Angola and Mozambique, which housed a sizable white landowning class, in 1945 only 4% of Guinea-Bissau's area was owned by Portuguese, and according to a 1950 census, there were only 2,263 recorded white settlers. These were mainly composed of civil servants, military personnel, and traders who profited from the territory's one cash crop, groundnut. The lack of Portuguese immigrants was mainly due to the fact that the country was largely made up of unproductive and inhospitable land. According to one Portuguese author, Raul de Mello, if Angola developed as the jewel of the Portuguese Empire, Guinea was never more than a scrap of brass. With little potential and interest for economic development, Portuguese rule was not as exploitative as it was elsewhere. Unlike in the other African colonies of Angola and Mozambique, the natives did not suffer from starvation, the practice of forced labour was minimal, and there was no mass displacement or impoverishment of the rural population. Thus, it comes as even more of a surprise that the most successful armed struggle ever waged against the Portuguese occurred in this half-forgotten colonial backwater. The seeds of revolution were first sown in 1956 with the formation of the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, or PAIGC, by Amilcar Cabral. Born in Portuguese Guinea in 1924 to well-to-do Cape Verdean parents, in 1945 he moved to Lisbon to study agronomy, where he became involved in underground student movements calling for the independence of the Portuguese colonies. At first, PAIGC engaged in non-violent trade union agitation, but this all changed on August 3, 1959. That day, over 50 dock and harbour workers striking for better wages were massacred by the Portuguese authorities, setting in motion a wave of nationwide repression. In response, PAIGC party members retreated into the countryside to prepare for armed struggle, and a base of operations was established in neighbouring Guinea, which had been granted independence from France a year earlier. From the years 1960 to 1962, the Revolutionary Army were trained by the Ghanaian military, and small detachments were sent to infiltrate the southern Bissauan countryside to mobilise villagers. In response, the Portuguese military initiated a campaign of intimidation akin to the Americans in Vietnam, in which suspect villages were subject to violent raids. Portuguese reprisals, however, only strengthened the rebels' hand, as their forces in Guinea swelled from 1,000 fighters in 1961 to over 13,000 by 1963. Taking advantage of the swampy terrain of their motherland, the rebels adhered to a conventional tactic of guerrilla warfare in which small contingents of armed men attacked and harassed Portuguese patrols, garrisons, and convoys from the undergrowth to prevent them from mustering counterattacks. While transport networks were disrupted with the blowing up of bridges, the blocking of roads, and the destruction of ferries, it soon became apparent that the Portuguese had seriously underestimated their foes. In July 1963, the Portuguese defence minister publicly admitted that numerous and well-armed groups had penetrated a zone equivalent to about 15% of the province. In February 1964, the PAIGC were presented with their first major military test on the island of Como, located in the southernmost corner of the country. During the showdown, the rebels were forced to abandon their guerrilla strategy and to engage the Portuguese military in conventional warfare. Lasting 75 days, the rebel forces emerged victorious, killing or wounding at least 900 enemy soldiers at enormous cost. From then on, the occupied southern territories of Guinea-Bissau were never again seriously challenged by the Portuguese, marking a significant turning point in the war. Having been embarrassingly defeated by an enemy viewed as inferior, the Portuguese ramped up the conscription of their young male population, which had originally been introduced in 1961 in response to the outbreak of revolution in Angola. In the months after the Como debacle, there were now 20,000 military reinforcements stationed in Guinea under the leadership of General Schultz, a veteran of the Angolan Wars of Independence. So unpopular was the forced enlistment that by August, the first cohort of Portuguese soldiers had deserted to the PAIGC. All the while, thousands of young men in Portugal fled to other countries such as the UK and France to avoid being sent to their deaths in an unknown and faraway province. As the Ghanaian nationalists started to become more heavily armed and professionally organised, with the creation of the PAIGC army at the end of 1964, the Portuguese were now finding themselves increasingly on the defensive. In 1967, the Portuguese witnessed record losses on the ground, with PAIGC sources claiming that just under 2,000 colonial troops were killed that year. Excessive infantry casualties prompted a shift in Portuguese military strategy towards indiscriminate air offensives from 1968 onwards. Extensive bombardments with napalm, fragmentation, and white phosphorus bombs led to the deaths of thousands of innocent Ghanaian citizens caught in the crossfire. At the same time, small squadrons of Portuguese troops dropped off in helicopters, slaughtered cattle, and burned the crops of particularly troublesome villages. With the assistance of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Cuba, the PAIGC countered attacks from these low-flying jets by developing its own anti-aircraft system by 1968. Yet this led to a considerable loss of accuracy from Portuguese pilots, leading to yet more collateral civilian deaths. By 1969, the rebels had so outclassed their former masters that road transport had come to a complete standstill. As the war entered a stalemate, the Portuguese gave up trying to regain territory, opting only to defend their remaining fortified camps and major cities. To achieve these limited aims, the army's strength was boosted to 40,000 men, its highest level during the entire war. Interestingly, 10,000 of these troops were recruited from Portugal's traditional native allies in the region, the Fulbe, who were organised into elite African commando units. From 1969 onwards, the Portuguese strategically withdrew from overly costly outposts and focused solely on the defence of a string of key forts, the intention being to cut off the PAIGC's supply lines. So-called free fire zones were established that allowed colonial forces to destroy villages and kill civilians as the war became exclusively conducted from the air. With the strategy failing to bear any fruit, in November 1970 the Portuguese launched a disastrous invasion by sea of Conakry in neighbouring Guinea, where Amilcar Cabral and the PAIGC were directing the war effort. When a ragtag force of conscripted troops were easily expelled, Portugal's international reputation lay in tatters. The failure of the intervention and the evolution of a military situation that gradually began to favour the PAIGC between 1971 to 1973 discredited the Portuguese internationally as well as domestically. Exacerbated by their defeats in the independence struggles of Angola and Mozambique, by this time the prospect of a military coup was becoming increasingly likely, and thousands had already left Portugal to avoid conscription. This can be illustrated by the fact that between 1970 and 1972, the Portuguese armed forces recorded a 21% record number of absentees. Internal turmoil was further fomented by militant anti-war groups who had started bombing campaigns to achieve their aims. In an effort to defuse the crisis and sow discord within the PAIGC leadership, drastic measures were now needed. At the instigation of the Portuguese secret police and pro-Portuguese elements within his own party, on January 20th, 1973, Amilcar Cabral was shot on his way to the PAIGC headquarters in Conakry. The murder of their leader only strengthened the party's resolve and galvanised them to carry out their most ambitious military operations yet to break the deadlock, paving the way for the proclamation of independence on September 24, 1973. The triumph of the Guinean rebels over their colonial overlords sent shockwaves throughout Portugal and its remaining African territories. On April 25, 1974, with the overwhelming support of the populace, 50 years of fascist rule were ended with the overthrow of the despotic administration of Marcelo Caetano by the Portuguese military. This was swiftly followed by the granting of independence to Angola in January 1975, and then Mozambique in June of the same year. To this day, the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence remains Portugal's worst and most embarrassing military defeat, and the spark that led to the collapse of its colonial empire.